So today on Recruiting Roundtable, we're discussing a very important topic, gender gaps. Joining us today are Allison Mairena, VP of People at NewGlobe, Daniel Grayson, former VP of Talent at Astronomer, and Margaret Gabriel, Head of People at CoinFund. Allison, Daniel, Margaret, thanks so much for joining. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Alrighty, so we always start the show with some intros. So I'd love to get some quick intros. We'll go around the horn. Please just introduce yourself, a little bit about your role and your company. Let's start with Margaret.
Okay, great. I'll be super fast so we can get to the interesting stuff. I'm Margaret Gabriel. I've been in people and talent for 10, 11 years. Was in admissions, undergrad admissions, then went to Google for recruiting, and then you too, Dan. And then got into crypto. So I'm part of a crypto investment firm at Gemini 2018, and then moved over to be our head of people and talent at CoinFund. CoinFund is a crypto investment firm. So we invest both in companies and founders within crypto and Web3 exclusively, as well as on the liquid side. And my career has pivoted between recruiting and actual leadership talent strategy as well. So my role is really hybrid. I support CoinFund and all of our people, leadership, culture, engagement initiatives, as well as any recruiting we need to do. But I also have the distinct pleasure of acting like an outsourced head of people and coach to all of our incredible portfolio company founders who in crypto and Web3 are navigating a lot of their own people and talent related challenges.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Margaret. We're going to unpack a little bit more about what you do. This is really interesting. Sure. Daniel.
Well, I'm Daniel. I'm Daniel Grayson. I until very, very recently, like almost last week, I was the VP of talent at an OSS, an open source data engineering company called Astronomer. We're built data pipelines and an AI/ML operations tool. Great experience. And before that, I was the head of recruiting operations for Rippling, as Rippling went from 300 heads to 1,200 heads. Prior to that, I worked as a consultant for human capital organizations, universities, schools, executive search and placement firms, recruiting organizations, all kinds of different things. Before that, for 10 years, I did college admissions, like Margaret. And I actually think there's a ton of perspective that working in higher education and admissions specifically gives you on things like gender and equity that I'm quite interested to talk about and to hear Margaret's take on too.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for joining. And lastly, Allison.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Sean. As it turns out, I did not work in college admissions. However, I do wonder, did you guys specifically vet a very education industry oriented group? Because I actually started my career as a teacher. And so, but not in higher ed. I was teaching English to students between the ages of 3 to 18 in Beijing. And so my career started in HR when I transitioned from teaching to joining the teacher recruitment and training team many years ago at EF Education First. And so was able to grow there quite a bit, transfer from their China headquarters to their North American headquarters about 10 years ago, and which time my role shifted more towards training and development and supporting the talent acquisition team, and did a little bit of time in staffing, worked at a very large ed tech player, Cengage, made my way over to startups for a little while. And when you go into a startup, there's, of course, no single role that you hold. And so that's when I really moved out of being exclusively on the TA side, very focused there, to really doing all the things. I don't even know if it's cool to say all the things anymore, but we'll say it. And so actually, interestingly enough, now I am in education again, although I spent the last 3.5 years in a health tech company, which was very pivotal during the pandemic. But currently at NewGlobe as VP of People, I oversee all facets of HR except for talent acquisition. But I do have very regular conversations with our VP of Talent Acquisition, to keep a pulse on things there. And thankfully, he's a really smart guy. And our what we're doing in the education space. We partner with governments predominantly in developing countries to bring technology and curriculum into public schools. So the bulk of our employee base and recruiting efforts are in sub-Saharan Africa and India.
Okay, great. Thank you, Allison. And lastly, my name is Sean Huynh. I'm the host of this podcast. I'm managing director at Rocket. I'm also VP of sales for HireFlow, which is a platform that Rocket launched. Long story short, we created an AI-powered sourcing platform that, on the Rocket side, fuels our recruiters and makes them more efficient. And also, we productize that technology for people that have their internal sourcing teams and want to, leverage the same AI technology. So that's what we do, and also having fun doing this podcast. And this is probably close to show number 20. So thank you all for making the time. Okay, so let's talk about this topic at hand, which is a meaty one, and we have a great panel. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about some of the biggest hurdles you've encountered in reaching gender parity within technology, within like the companies you work for. And just curious of if there's any things that in particular stand out to you as it relates to that. I want to start with Margaret, because I know, Margaret, when you mentioned being crypto, definitely this is a thing. So I'd love to get your feedback on this.
We just have tons of women in crypto. I'm shocked. So what's interesting? So I'm going to preface by saying I don't know the answer to any of this gender disparity stuff. And that's why I'm here. I really want to talk about it and think about how to actually solve for it. Because what I worry about, Sean, is that it's very easy to be like an issue spotter around gender and like much harder to be a problem solver.
Mhm.
So I could like stout statistics to you all day, and we can all sit here and like quote a bunch of articles and surveys that show that gender gaps are still here in pay, in leadership. Maybe they're closing in certain areas, but then the real question is like, what do we do about it besides just keep talking about it? So I don't know the answer, but that's one of the reasons I'm here, and I'm excited to have Daniel, because I think as we had discussed, Sean, in launching and doing this podcast, like it's also not, I don't think, super helpful for women to just keep talking about it and not have like asking the question to men, not in an argumentative way and like what are you going to do about it way, but more like, why do you think this is happening? I could give you a bunch of reasons, but what do men think, and how much do they actually care? And again, not in a provocative way, but really, like, how much does it matter? And I really do believe the world is run by incentives. So like, how are we all incentivized to make anything different? So besides it just being the right thing to do, from like a capitalistic perspective, like what's the impact? So that's just my preface. In terms of your question of what I've noticed, keep in mind too, I'm coming at this now very differently than I did 10 years ago, because now I'm a mom. And that has opened up like an entirely new window of gender gap and disparity than I had experienced before. And what I've observed is, and like what some of the data is showing, I literally just read a survey, speaking of surveys, last week from this renowned like compensation data company that does a lot of, it's kind of like the premier go-to for PE venture comp firms. And they showed that the gender gap is actually closing for pay, but for junior people in VC, which is really exciting. Let's not knock that. That's awesome. And hopefully it has downstream effects. But I think what's interesting is that like, as women continue to like primarily take on the additional labor of like parenting and running a household, I think that's where a lot of the gender gaps start to really not get fixed. And that's where you see women not being able to do it all, and step into those really big leadership positions and manage a household. I see my like just like really anecdotal feedback now that I'm amongst like mothers in my peer group. You just see the pressure that a lot of women are under to go back into the office, to like drop their children at daycare, to leave early enough to go get the child at daycare and miss a meeting or be less engaged, or because of that, or like not be able to stay at the office late, or not be able to go get a drink with people, with the leadership team, or like not be able to just jump on a flight and go out to, like, we just had a couple conferences in crypto, and it's like harder sometimes stereotypically for the mom to just be like, okay, I'm gonna go to Denver for 4 days and like leave my toddler. I can't do that personally. So I think there is a lot of nuance to that. behind the data of gender gaps at a senior level. And that's obviously not to say that all women are moms or that all women are the primary caretaker, but I do think that has a lot of influence as you get to like the leadership level, why we don't see more women in leadership, and then why women in leadership are making less. And so I think I'm really encouraged that there's some data showing that at the junior level, we're seeing like some gap closing, but I just don't know what to do. I have some ideas about the more senior level, but I think that has a really big impact.
Margaret, you're making me think about an HR leader I once heard talk about like the mentorship and sponsorship gap in gender. That like most people, when they look to sponsor or mentor someone in a more junior position, are looking for like the younger version of themselves who reminds me of me 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and like let me help that person up. And how easy it is for people to fall into the trap of like me, meaning looks like me, instead of thinks like me, and even thinks like me. And, you know, for better or worse, so much of how we understand, perceive, move through the world, absorb information, spit information back out is grounded in things like gender, race, socioeconomic status, the passport you had, the country you grew up in. And so, you know, when you don't hear yourself reflected in a younger version of you, I think it's a lot harder to like dig in and do the mentorship and sponsorship work. And so when you start compiling like all of those pressures that you just listed off that make it like structurally difficult to lean in at the exact moment when your career could take off in terms of seniority, combined with you've got senior men who are not always seeing themselves reflected in the women who could come up. And I think it's a recipe for some serious like ceiling issues. As women in particular go from like not just junior to mid, and not even from mid to senior, but from like senior to leadership.
Yeah. And then I think we like end up with this situation where women decide, at some women, not all, someone have to make this really impossible decision of like, do I keep grinding? Do I kind of drop out a little bit? And they're being forced to like make a decision around the structure versus the structure changing in any way to support them. And that's hard. It's really hard. It's a really hard problem.
I do think, though, to your point of caregiving, I mean, obviously, this doesn't address the issue of like not being able to hop on a plane and go to Denver for however many days, right? But like, first off, getting drinks with executives after work, I mean, we have to be mindful to be inclusive of those who don't drink, you know, socially, right? But moreover, I think the easy kind of like actionable item there, I say easy, but like easier or perhaps more inclusive way to go about some of those bonding times is to bake it into earlier hours in the day. So that way we can include caregivers. And to expand upon that definition of caregiver too, not just parents, but also those who are having caregiving duties for their parents, right? Because statistically, so much of the world, and particularly in the United States, has had such a dramatic fall in birth rate now that we have a greater aging population. And so more often than not now, we find that, you know, millennials, Gen Z, you know, all of these generations that are in the workforce now actively working are taking on parental caregiving or caretaking duties. So another important call out.
Yeah.
But I'd also like to say that I think that there's a big hurdle in leadership not understanding why this matters. This is one of the things where like I was actually quite excited to join the panel as a man, because I've been in spaces where I've heard predominantly male leaders say things in rooms I've been in that I don't think they would have said if I was a woman, that revealed the gap between the rhetoric they were willing to use and the actions they were willing to take. I've had leaders who were openly apathetic about the need for more gender parity. I've had leaders who were openly hostile. I mean, I actually heard a leader say about a desire to find more women for an internship program that he was more concerned with keeping the quality bar high. And the clear implication was, if we bring more women into the internship program, we will be lowering the bar.
Right.
And so, you know, I think that there's also like a lack of organizational buy-in that exists because companies don't understand why this matters to their bottom line. And I do think that's the case that like has to be made. It's not that there's a social good around this, because as much as we would like for that to be sufficiently motivating, it's just not going to be, and we can see very clearly that it's not going to be. And so I think there's a very specific transactional, pragmatic, financial set of incentives around greater diversity in the workplace, and particularly around gender. Like we collectively need to get better at articulating. We all work for companies. I shouldn't say we all. The companies that Margaret and Allison just listed off are companies that are like definitionally trying to do things that will change or move the world, right? There's like a nimbleness that needs to be there. And I don't know how a company is expected to build something that can change over time and be durable over time if the only voices that are represented and the only voices that have safety within a given company are the ones that fit the mold for what traditional looks like or what dominant looks like. Like, you need non-dominant voices and non-dominant perspectives in companies, because they are the thing that, if you can make them safe, enables the kind of massive transformation within organizations that allows a company to last for longer than 5 or 10 years. And so if you can't make space for those people, then you can't make space for new ideas. And if you can't make space for new ideas, you can't be financially successful in the long run. And I think we need to do a better job of demonstrating why that's the case and proving it out through both our own internal learnings and the academic research that very clearly exists in this.
Well, and I think the other piece too, right, is like, and we don't have to get into this today. We don't have to totally spill tea, right? But, I'm happy to share my own short anecdote to say, like, when I was a part of an organization that really showed their true colors about not caring, at least within my department, about creating a diverse and inclusive environment. And this isn't as specific on gender gap here, right? Like, the company at the time, this is years ago, CEO had said in that year that, making sure that our team was not only more diverse, but we were also being very inclusive at the time, was a priority. The first thing my company did was started to create employee resource groups. And it was a great first step. We were all pretty excited about it. And the first ERG, employee resource group, that was formed was to support LGBTQIA plus individuals. And so we were all pretty excited about it. I joined, and in the next HR department team meeting that I was at, I said, hey, I'm really excited. We've got the Pride Employee Resource Group live. Like, what's next on this? There's this a job fair here, and that's hosted by the city of Boston, that has 80% of attendees identifying as Black and Indigenous people of color. And it's at no cost to us. So, like, let's sign up and go. It's, next month or whenever. And I was told, no, we're not going to go to that. I'm like, oh, well, why? And the response was, we don't have branding ready for it. And I said, oh, okay, well, sure, maybe we can't get that in time, but what's next? I really was bought into this. And at that time, my then VP of Talent Acquisition said straight up, we've already checked that box for the year. And no sooner than the next day was I looking for a new job. I was like, this is not the place for me. I'm very grateful to hear that that organization has done a complete 360, and also that individual was terminated. Was it related to that? I don't know, right? But I was like, wow, these are not my people. And so you don't have to necessarily stay in those environments where people are going to make statements like that. You yourself can make a statement by not accepting it and finding those that are open to hearing about it.
Yeah. And Allison, I think that's part of the pragmatic case, right? Is like, really high quality technical talent is hard to find. 20% of the new, college computer science college graduates are women. So if your organization demonstrates that it is not a good place for any given demographic to work, if you conservatively figure that that's 15% of the talent market between women who won't go work there and men who won't go work there because women are treated poorly, and 15% I think is quite conservative, you've shut yourself out from 15% of the talent market before you've done anything. And like, that's a substantial deficit to have to start from. And so I think that's a great story, and thank you for sharing it.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'm getting chills. We're getting deep, and that was the first question. I'm really loving the engagement. Thank you, everyone, for your insights. So let's continue talking about some examples of where there's been barriers to gender equality that maybe you observed in maybe your current workplace or other workplaces. And how do you think this affects your team and the company as a whole? Maybe we'll start with Daniel on this.
So I'll pick up where I just was, which is I think there's a reverse snowball that starts to happen when you don't solve these problems. Like if you're a small company and you still have gender issues, or you've got a 15-person engineering team and none of them are women, and you want to talk about the aspiration to get better, and it's only a 15%, there's some level of forgiveness that candidates will have for you when you can't demonstrate you're good at this and you're small. And as you get larger and larger and larger, that grace goes away, as it should. And you find yourself in a position where like your company or your organization or your recruiting team has poured concrete over this problem that now makes it impossible to solve. And so, I've seen this at organizations I've been a part of and consulted with. And so, to me, I think that that's a very concrete example of like when you start getting candidates who specifically start saying, look, you don't have a single woman on this interview panel. That's a red flag for me.
Yeah.
And then for every person who says that out loud, there's probably 10 people who didn't say it out loud and still used it as a factor in their decision making. And so, I think that that's a very clear barrier. Like if you're not getting good at this, like there's no way to stay in one place. You're either getting better or you're getting worse.
Yeah. I would say like it's a really good point. And from a recruiting perspective, it's true. There's like, data that shows like the more women that are just in the interview process, the more likely you are to then hire a woman. If you only have one woman in the interview process, it's very little chance you'll hire her. You asked Sean about hurdles. And I think what's interesting about this time period is that sometimes the issues are very scarily apparent, like Allison's example, and some other like kind of like horrifying examples I could share lately of some of my friends who still work in like traditional finance, and some of the things that I hear about that is like feels like another generation's worth of gender issues. But I actually think the majority, especially when we're talking about tech, which tends to be a more progressive area of employment, I think some of the hurdles are just a little more nuanced and a little more subtle, but still create like real tangible barriers. So some small examples, if it's helpful to your audience, to just like keep their antenna up for when they're at work. And then maybe we could talk about like what you do about that and when you're in those situations. So language matters a lot. So Dan gave a really good example of people saying, yeah, we want gender, but we can't lower the bar. And creating this, like you're in the room, you're like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean lower the bar? Can you define the bar for me? And you can say those things in a way that gently challenges the person to really articulate what they mean, because it can be easy to drop those types of turns of phrase that actually that sound a little innocuous, but kind of allow that person to get away with some really like serious bias. And so you can gently say, tell me what you mean. Like, what do you mean by the bar? I want to make sure I understand, especially if I'm recruiting, like, what's the bar? And then you can start to show candidates who are female and who like match the bar that they articulated in that meeting. So that's one thing. Like, what is the language people use? The other piece I see to relate to Allison's example of ERGs, I see this a lot, is the culture might get like excited or maybe not so excited, maybe feel obligated, or really like genuinely care about some employee resource groups and like supporting underrepresented people. And then they put the burden of like fixing the issue on the underrepresented group. So like the ERG for women, the expectation is, well, women are going to form that group and run it and make the change, right? And we'll sit here and like support you. But can you make the blog post about International Women's Day? And can you also like make sure the content looks good and write a blog post while you're at it? And so paradoxically, we're like adding a bunch of work to the plate of women who are who on a day and a time where we're like supposed to be helping them. We're like, can you fix the issue? But it sounds and kind of feels generally to that group like support. And I say this, what's really important is I don't think this is intentional malice or like continued desire to create. I just think it's a practiced area of like their muscle of support means like verbally supporting you and starting up a group, and then women run it. Or like the Black resource group, like we put the onus on the Black employees to educate everybody else and like help fix the issue. And I would love to see like employee resource groups co-run by a man and a woman, for example, for like if it's about gender. So I think the like continued expectation that the underrepresented group, and let's talk about women because we're talking about gender, obviously in a very binary sense, we could get into obviously all the definitions of gender here, but women also bearing the burden of like fixing the problem and educating men is exhausting.
Yeah,
and they don't have
solving a culture they don't own.
They're already like, especially if they're getting to the area where they're a caregiver and they're like, now I have to write a blog post about how hard it is to be a woman. Like, pass. I don't want to do that. And so it's this
actually a monologue from the Barbie movie, right? And
yeah.
Copy paste.
The other thing I see is like, again, these smaller things, like what we call like corporate housekeeping. So who's scheduling the meetings? Who's taking the notes in the meetings? Who's cleaning up the conference room? Who's setting up the all team offsite? Who's like putting together the happy hour and the holiday party? Even if you don't have, let's say, like an EA or an office person who does this for you, I guarantee you it almost always falls on the woman in that group, even if it's like a woman in leadership. So just notice. And if you're a man in that situation, just ask to do it or like volunteer. Or if you're a woman, just generally be like, I'm out for this one. Can someone step in? Just see what happens if you don't step in. Like, who's going to do it?
Margaret, I deliberately coach my the junior women on my team, like say no to those projects.
Yeah.
Like because like, you're at a company that has 15% women and all 5 of the people who are responsible for putting together the company offsite are women. Like, that's not an accident.
Yeah.
And
but Dan, it's so hard. Like if you're like leader or CEO bestows it upon you and you kind of see that as like, this is like and then by the way, when it comes to performance review time, that stuff, even though it's actually a ton of work for her, doesn't matter. It doesn't get the weight of anything revenue generating. So she's pulled away from real work to do this big thing that has impact.
Yeah, but
like it's not valuable.
I offer the advice to them because I'm willing to provide them the air cover to get away with it. But like that's where I think like allyship becomes so critical. And like you can't change the culture if you don't own it, right? Yeah. And so if the people above you don't get it and they're not willing to get it, and if you're a man in a management position and you're watching your women staff members disproportionately get saddled with this work and you don't step up and coach them on how to say no and make it clear that you've got their back if they want to.
Totally.
Like, you can't really solve the problem. Like it's, I know that one of the questions I could ask around this is like, what technology, what innovation, what can we do that's new? Honestly, the way to solve, maybe not all of it, but a very healthy portion of it is like basic stuff.
Totally.
It's like not complicated. It's not sophisticated. It's like help coach people who are people pleasers to not feel like they need to be people pleasers, to put their own ambitions like high enough up their own priority list that they're not just doing things because somebody asked, that they learn the skill of how to say no, and they learn that people have their back when they need to. It's hard work, but it's like not complicated work.
Totally.
I think to go back to Margaret's point about, in the question of like, oh, I don't want to lower the bar and pushing back gently, which is another great thing too. I think, and this is my translation, right, isn't so much that, hiring managers are intentionally trying to be uninclusive in this, but rather what is easier, right? So if you have a ton of applicants, particularly in the tech industry, that do identify as male, right? And, you have a plethora or majority of inbound applicants, and even if you're using AI to source, we all know AI is also biased too, because historically tech has been so heavily favored by male employees, right? That perpetuates. And so it makes it easier for them to just say, oh, okay, well, the bulk of our application pool looks like this. And so for time to hire purposes, right, let's move forward with what we have. And we need to be really intentional about suggesting what are the ways that we can, diversify these sourcing strategies, whether it's taking a look at the job description, right? There are both free tools and paid tools like Textio that will help to look at the job description and remove some of that gendered language. You can alter all of the pronouns to be you, so that way it's inclusive of those that aren't going with the gender binary, right? And it also helps them to see themselves in that role. You can also remove years of experience, saying some experience or several years, so that way women and BIPOC applicants don't self-select out because they don't check every single freaking box, right? And statistically, so many do self-select out simply because they say, oh, well, I've only got 7 years of experience. This is looking for 8. Well, that's a load of horse crap. I'm here to tell you, folks, like, if you have several years of experience, just apply and see what happens. I became ahead of people at the age of 28. Like, that's absolutely absurd, but somehow that happened, and I was able to move into that role, and admittedly learned a heck of a lot earlier in my career than I really anticipated. But your years of experience, your gender, any of these demographics shouldn't matter. It should be the skill and the will. And we have to remove some of these barriers that can start as early as the application process and sourcing process to get those barriers out of the way.
And so just wrapping up a little bit and stepping in for Sean here because he had to step out. I want to end this on like sort of a positive note. As Margaret mentioned earlier, like male allies are like super crucial when it comes to advancing gender diversity. And Daniel had mentioned earlier that he had coached some of the more junior female employees on his team, and I thought that was super helpful. So with this last question, and we'll start with you, Allison, what are some effective ways that you've seen men engage in these efforts at your current company, a previous company, somewhere in your career? Like, has men ever stepped up to be helpful when it comes to these gender parities? What have you seen, and like, what would you want to see more of in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need to find those that are open to discussion, and ideally it's somebody that's coming from C-suite, right? And if they aren't quite there yet, presenting the plethora of articles from Deloitte, McKinsey, you name it, it's out there supporting, greater gender representation will help your business, and by a lot financially. Is a part, but so more tactically in a mentorship program for women plus at my last organization, we had, folks volunteer from, all levels of the company and all demographics to say, hey, I would like to mentor someone from our Women in Tech employee resource group. And so that was really successful in getting a wide variety of mentors available for women across all of the demographics and levels of the organization. But also, too, I think that another successful piece that we've had at NewGlobe isn't necessarily rooted in allyship, and male allyship in particular, but as Margaret kind of alluded to earlier, paying attention to gaps that predominantly women may face. And so one thing that we did in Bayelsa State, which is a state in Nigeria, we had this big job fair, but in order to get news out to people, we had to use a town crier, which is kind of absurd to think about in a lot of like Western countries in tech, right? Because so many candidates and talent aren't necessarily on LinkedIn in those areas. But moreover, we actually provided on-site childcare during this job fair day. And by doing that, we were able to increase our gender representation in that state from 36% female up to 41.4% from that one event alone. And so many of the female candidates said specifically, hey, it's because you were able to offer the childcare that I was able to come and learn about these opportunities. So I think making those switches is pretty important.
Yep. I could jump in. I would say I have a couple of anecdotes. I know I have to be quick. I think overall, though, women at every level, including like they're never too senior to do this, need champions. And I think you need to be really outwardly championing the woman at your company, and just simply checking in to just say like, how does it feel? Like, how's it going? Don't be afraid to bring up the topic because most of the time the women are feeling that anyway. I'll give you an anecdote because I know that like that was a question, and how have men specifically been helpful. At CoinFund, I've received an unbelievable amount of support from 5 male managing partners. And championing doesn't mean that you like look the other way when the person doesn't do excellent work. And I'm treated exactly the same as any counterparty and given really tough feedback about like decisions I've made or behavior, not my personality, not like my style, but my actual work. And that's really critical. Like, how are you delivering feedback? Again, I go back to like language. What's the language you're using? Because it matters a lot. And women are oftentimes given feedback about like personality and style, and men are usually given feedback on output. And at CoinFund, I'm given feedback on output. And one little anecdote, I share this all the time. I share it almost any time I talk about gender, about CoinFund, or about podcasts. So, but I'll share it again because it's meaningful. I actually I was recruited to CoinFund when I was 12 weeks pregnant. So wasn't sharing with anybody, very new, had no idea what was going to happen. Certainly wasn't looking to change jobs during that time. Needed to like bake in my maternity leave, needed to make sure everything was safe and secure. And instead decided to join a crypto VC. And one of the reasons I did was because our managing partner, as we were like, the conversations were going pretty quickly. And I called him and I said, listen, like, I think this is a really incredible opportunity. It sounds like a really important role to you and this firm. And I need you to know I'm 12 weeks pregnant. So if you do decide to move to an offer, you need to know. And I need maternity leave. And I don't know if that works for you. Like, I don't know if you're okay with this person setting up shop and then like disappearing for 4 months and then coming back and like adjusting to being a new mom and everything that entails. And it's a big factor in everyone's decision. And truly without a pause, this partner said, that's amazing news. Doesn't change anything for us. And so that's the reason I joined. Like, a lot of other reasons, but that's a huge factor. And so I think it's really important that men are just understanding the full female experience and championing them, like acknowledging what's happening, asking what's happening at home, how are your kids, like what's going on, before you just jump into the meeting, because that stuff comes into their work life. It does for every parent, but oftentimes even more so for the mom, I have to say.
And Daniel, you want to take us home?
I try not to assume what's going to be helpful, and so instead I ask. I don't know. I think it's really easy to think you know what someone needs. And I'd say the same thing. I mean, to the conversation earlier about like ERGs and how amazing it would be to have like a man as part of an ER, like co-running an ERG. Like I asked at my company, I was like, do you want me? Like, I'd love to do this with you. And they're like, no, actually here in particular, we really feel like we need a space where like people feel like they're not being watched by folks outside the demographic. And I was like, that's fine. And so I do think that there's an element of like, what is it that the actual women you actually work with need to feel supported, secure, and ready to advance? And if you don't ask, you can't know.
Amen to that.
Amen to that. Well, we're out of time. I mean, we could have gone for another hour. And sorry, I had to step out quickly. My wife was calling. She's like, this is really important. And it actually really was. So thank you, Lucy, for jumping in. That was great teamwork. This is probably one of the most engaging panels we've had. I talked the least of any show, which I think is a good thing. So thank you, Daniel, Allison, Margaret. You really brought it today. You brought amazing perspectives. I learned a ton today and stuff that I'm going to practice in my day-to-day. So thank you all. Anyone listening, this is a very important show. I definitely recommend you check this out. Until next time, thank you so much. This is Recruiting Roundtable. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.